Let's start.
Okay.
And we're live. Welcome, everybody. People will be joining us shortly, but I'll just start by saying thank you for joining us. Today, we're speaking to Michael Sercan Daventry, a Turkish journalist who also runs jamesinturkey.com, highly recommended and great resource for Turkish election watchers. He makes websites, polls, podcasts, and also some deep dive videos. That's jamesinturkey.com. And we're speaking to Michael Sercan Daventry. Just to set the scene before we get into the Q&A, there's a vote Sunday in Turkey. We have elections. People tuning in will know that the elections are huge, pivotal, and the outcome will define domestic and foreign politics for years to come in Turkey. You'll also know that these elections are taking place on an unlevel playing field. There's many factors favoring the incumbent, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, versus the main opposition candidate, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. These elections come about 3 months after massive earthquakes, and there's still some challenges posed by the earthquake aftermath in how voting will happen in the earthquake zone and what logistics will look like. These elections also take place amid a serious economic crisis that's really punishing Turkish citizens and making daily life and expenses hard to deal with for many. So, looking at Sunday, there's many concerns about election security and potential violence. İmamoğlu, the Istanbul mayor, was subject to an attack Sunday in Erzurum. Some people threw stones at him and he cut a rally short. So all these factors make for an atmosphere of high stakes and high stress, which is also the birthplace of Turkey Recap, a coping mechanism for Turkey watchers worldwide. I'm just going to say, what is Turkey Recap? We are a reader-supported newsletter. We are run by journalists in Turkey, and we have no support from institutions or political parties. We operate only with Patreon, Substack, and merch sales. That's our income. And we're determined to keep delivering essential news and updates on post-earthquake and post-election Turkey. So with that, I'll turn it to Michael, and I'm just going to ask if you want to highlight anything that you'll be watching on Sunday.
Well, Diego, thank you. I'm really pleased to be here. I want to say 2 very quick things before I turn to the election. Firstly, to everyone watching, can I please encourage you to support Turkey Recap? It's an excellent resource. I've been following it ever since Diego set it up with Razia Akkoç, who's now moved on in AFP to other things. And they do what all of us want to do, but don't quite get around to doing, which is to check pretty much every single news story that is published in Turkey for the week. It's a brilliant resource. Throw them your coffee money at least once in the lead up to this election. It's very, very important. And the other thing I want to say is that I am a journalist who does, and I do run jamesinturkey.com, not as well as I'd like to, I have to say, particularly in the run up to this election, but life has been rather busy. I work for several other news organizations, including Sky and the BBC, and I'm not here on their behalf. I'd like just to make that clear. I'm here for myself. Having said that, this is probably the most exciting Turkish election that I've ever watched. I've got memories. I was fairly young of the 1995 election when everybody said that the religious party would make no gains whatsoever and that it was impossible that people could possibly vote for a party that was threatening Turkey's secular order. And yet it happened. Probably since then, this is the most exciting election that I've followed, maybe with the exception of 2002. So I am very interested in what's going to happen. It's partly because there are so many unknowns. But rather than me rabbiting on, I think it's probably best we get on to some questions.
Yeah, so let's start simple. The first question we got was, how would you recommend people follow developments on election night Do you recommend any news channels or live streams or news sources to follow Turkish elections?
It really depends on if you speak Turkish. If you do, you've obviously got a far greater range of options out there. I am Turkish and I speak the language, so I'll be following a lot of Turkish outlets. For those who don't, will inevitably, I expect, be relying on Twitter. James in Turkey will be doing stuff. I'm sure Diego will be doing bits and pieces as well. But Turkish elections are notoriously difficult to follow because of the way in which the results start being made public. And perhaps if you give me 30 seconds, I'll briefly explain what happens. Voting is between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. on Sunday. And at 5 p.m., the ballot boxes will close. And from that point, there are about 100,000 ballot boxes around the country. As soon as the votes are sealed, the ballot box is opened up again. And every vote is counted there and then in the room where the polling box is situated, and the votes are held up for everyone to see. And there is a statement of about 100 or so votes that are in that ballot box that will be taken up. That statement will be tweeted by many people. And in the early hours of the election, you'll start getting people saying, well, this ballot box in deepest, darkest Diyarbakir, or this ballot box in Trabzon, or this ballot box in Şişli has produced a monumental result for Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, for Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, or Sinan Oğan appears to have won this ballot box. It means very little. So I would advise anyone who's following the election to avoid the results of individual ballot boxes. We're talking about 60 million votes that are going to be cast in this election. One ballot box isn't really going to set it for them. But do follow Twitter, follow the more sensible sources. And I'd probably advise avoiding the English language broadcast outlets that do exist, like TRT World, simply because you're not going to get the context that I think you need in this election. And the context is that there are two sides. There is a government narrative and there's an opposition narrative, and TRT World will be giving you the government narrative.
Great. So moving on with just starter questions. When will we know the results? And what are the formalities in accepting the results or calling for a second round?
So on Sunday night, as I say, 5 p.m. ballot boxes will close. We go through the process that I just described, where all the ballots are looked at. Then all the ballots are bundled back into the box and escorted to the district, to the ilçe election centre. And that's the point when we will hear from the Supreme Election Council. When they say that they've accounted for all 100,000 ballot boxes, that's the point when results will start to become published. And until then, there's going to be a broadcast ban. So we won't get a fair idea immediately after 5 o'clock what the national picture is. The YSK, the YSK, the Supreme Election Council, has a provision in place until 9 o'clock, 9 p.m. Turkish time. So between 5 p.m. when the polls close and 9 p.m. when the broadcast ban is lifted, there's a 4-hour blackout when Turkish broadcasters and theoretically websites, though a lot of them don't observe it, have to observe the ban. Now, I haven't watched a Turkish election where that 9 p.m. deadline hasn't been brought forward. It's normally lifted at about 6:30, sometimes around 7 o'clock. And that's when we'll start to get a picture of the first picture. Probably around 20% of the vote will be in by then. By, I'd say, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock Sunday evening, we should have pretty much well over 90% of the ballot boxes declared. They will be focusing on the presidential election first before the parliamentary one, simply because the presidential election has a potential second round. And one of the first things that the YSK has to do is to declare that one candidate has made it over the 50% mark and there's no need for a second round, or that no candidate has made it over the 50% mark, and therefore there needs to be a second round, and it will declare which two candidates have made it, even if they don't necessarily declare how many votes each candidate has received. But that should happen fairly swiftly in the early hours of Monday morning, certainly by Monday lunchtime, simply because they need to start printing ballot papers for a second round, and they need to start sending them overseas, because overseas voting begins the following weekend. It's all very, very tight. So that's the mechanics of a second round. But one word that a lot of Turkey followers or new Turkey followers will hear thrown around in the coming week will be the word mazbata, which means essentially election credentials. It's the certificate that the election authorities will give a winning candidate to say, yeah, you've won the election, you can now do your job. And this process has never been controversial before until 2019, when the Istanbul mayoralty election was called and then annulled for Ekrem İmamoğlu, the opposition candidate. There is the potential that there is another fight around the mazbata given to the president, the president-elect, shall we say, particularly if that candidate that wins is Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. But as I say, things will be clearer by Monday. It may well be, however, that we just create more confusion.
Yeah. Thanks for mentioning the details there, which are important for people watching. We have a few questions about general security situation in Istanbul or maybe Ankara, big cities. Is there anything that people should expect or look out for? Will there be, I saw that schools will be closed on 15 May. Will services or roads or will anything be functioning differently the day of or after on elections in major cities?
Well, I suppose this is quite relevant to foreigners in particular, who are living in Turkey at the time and haven't been through a Turkish election. There are, as always with most things in Turkey, there are rules, and then there's the reality. And the rules say that all places of entertainment have to close on election day. There's a total ban on the sale of alcohol, lest you buy several bottles of beer and then decide to cast your votes while drunk. There is also a series of other restrictions on what public officials can do. If you wanted to go and buy a bottle of wine from your local supermarket, I don't think there will be much difficulty in you buying that bottle in reality. But schools being closed is an interesting one, because pretty much every polling station in Turkey tends to be a school classroom. There are some that are set up in other places. And it is a monumentally disruptive thing for schools. There have been elections where elections are always on a Sunday, and there have been elections when schools have reopened on a Monday, but just the physical arrangement of the classroom, the positions of desks and chairs just haven't made it possible for classes to resume. So it seems like it's a measure towards that. In terms of the greater security situation, I've had a few people come to me, both Turks and foreigners, I've got to say, who are worried about the security around the election time. Honestly, I'm not worried. I feel, and I say this from the safety of London, I appreciate that, but I've been through enough elections to know what things to avoid. The things to avoid really are, I mean, unless we're talking about a significant attack of some sort, which again I think is quite unlikely. The biggest safety risk I tend to see is on election night is celebrating supporters who think it's a good idea to fire guns in the air, and that's when you tend to get people accidentally hurt. But other than that, I don't think that it's going to be a particularly dangerous place to be in Turkey, and political tension shouldn't happen unless, of course, there is a close call election. But perhaps we'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah, so we have many questions on polling. Apparently, someone asked there should be a polling ban after May 4th. Is this true? There shouldn't be any more polls?
It is true. There is a ban on publishing polls after a date, and I'm afraid I haven't got the date in front of me. May the 4th sounds a little early to me, because that does sound it's 10 days ahead of it. It might be true, but there is a point when you aren't allowed to publish opinion poll data. Having said that, that part of the law is a bit antiquated, and it refers to broadcast television and newspapers, and it doesn't tend to cover the internet. So I mean, I know of two reputable pollsters who are publishing their final outcomes, their final predictions rather for the election tomorrow, Thursday, which is 3 days or 4 days before voting day. So it's one of those laws that I think is loosely enforced, shall I say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we have a lot of polling companies putting out research before the elections, and people are asking which ones are trustworthy, and just what's your general sense of what the polls are saying and whether they reflect reality with the presidential election and parliamentary election?
The basic rule of thumb is that I've always approached with Turkish polling, and I've followed a lot of it over the past decade, is you have to assume that it is untrustworthy. Don't assume that it is trustworthy. It's because it isn't the practice in Turkey, unlike a lot of European countries and in the United States. It isn't generally the practice for pollsters to give information about how they gathered the poll. There are, in this election, as there have been in previous elections, companies that just pop out of nowhere and they say, they use the word araştırma, which means research. They come up with a couple of letters before, so you'll get OPL araştırma, and then they will say, our polling has found that Recep Tayyip Erdogan's AK Party will produce 42% of the vote and the CHP will get 7% of the vote, and it goes on and on like that. I tend to take those pollsters with a pinch of salt. The measure, it's part of the reason, actually, that I created a poll tracker for James in Turkey. The individual polls that I fed into it aren't necessarily ones that I trust more than other ones, but they're pollsters that I have seen that have been following a certain pattern over the years that I've been following them. So there are some that lean towards the government, there are some that lean towards the opposition, and there are some that have been fairly decently middle of the road. And it's not about the headline figures for me, it's always been the change. The change at which the parties have moved. And there's a graphic here that I would love to show you, but I'll just have to tweet it out later on, I suppose, just showing over the last, since December 2019, the progress of the parties. And basically, the trend over the last 2 years has been that there are very few polls where the AK Party is not the top party. It looks like that will be the result of this election. In the parliamentary election, the AK Party will get the most MPs and the highest share of the vote. There's been an upturn in the last couple of months in favor of the AK Party. There's also been an upturn in favor of the CHP, the main opposition party. In the last couple of months, the party that suffered the most is Meral Akşener's İYİ Party. There's been a dramatic drop in its fortunes, and this is reflected across all the pollsters that I have followed, both pro-government and anti-government, have been, or rather pro-opposition rather than anti-government. They have all recorded from their corresponding levels a drop in the rate of support for them. And that is the measure that I follow. It's how much the polls have changed over the months rather than the headline figures.
Yeah. And as Turkey Recap, we also published a guide to pollsters, which I highly recommend.
May I highly recommend it as well. I promise you, I'm not paid to make these endorsements.
Thank you. Let's see. Just another more basic question. There's record overseas voting. I think you tweeted out a photo of yourself voting at a voting place. And I think we saw some fights breaking out in, was it Netherlands, at a polling station during pre-election voting?
I think there was one there. There was a fight in London, which I passed on to me as well. I think there've been fights at a few polling stations, but there are fights in Turkish polling stations as well. So this isn't unusual. Turkish people will behave, some at least will behave in a certain way, and now that everyone's got a phone, that it all tends to be filmed.
Yes. Yeah. So the question about overseas voting and how the numbers are very high this year apparently is who will this favor? And I guess it depends on the country and the diaspora in that country, right? What do you think?
Well, I voted in the UK, and the UK has a very high Kurdish population. So Selahattin Demirtas, when he was a presidential candidate in previous years, has won here before. The HDP, which isn't running in this election, has triumphed in the party votes before. But that's very much against the grain, really. In continental Europe, it's where voters tend to be, Turkish overseas voters tend to be more conservatively minded. And actually, when you meet them, they tend to be, broadly speaking here, people who are interested in going back to Turkey eventually, rather than settling in the European country in which they live. The support there tends to be more pro the government's, definitely pro the AK Party. I've seen a lot of commentary, Diego, and you've probably seen as well, actually, I'm sure, about about overseas voters and whether or not they are it's a good thing that Turkey has an overseas voting system, this body of 3 million people or so who have the potential to influence the outcome of the election, whether or not they should be allowed. And I've seen people who are on the government side of the debate and people who are on the opposition side of the debate all saying either, yes, it's fine, they should vote, or no, absolutely not, they shouldn't, because they may swing the result against the outcome that I want. This is the third time that in a presidential election that Turkish voters overseas are voting. So we don't have a huge amount of precedent to go on. But the precedent that we do have suggests that Turkish voters, generally speaking, vote in line with Turkish voters overseas, vote in line with Turkish voters in Turkey. There are countries where the proportion is certainly higher for President Erdogan and has been in previous elections. We don't know how it will be in this one, but in the presidential election, there hasn't been a presidential overseas vote that has changed the result of the domestic vote. The overseas vote has altered the parliamentary vote in certain ways, but not the presidential vote. I don't see it happening this time either. I could be proven wrong, but it would be quite scandalous if, for instance, Turkey domestically votes for Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, but narrowly, and it turns out that the overseas vote swung it back in favor of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. That would be an astonishing result, but it isn't one that I'm expecting.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. So we have a question about the earthquake and how it might complicate elections. I think the person's asking how you think it might change voter attitudes. A lot of reports and articles, including some that we've published by Gonca Tokyo and Ingrid Vodwig, show that voter tendencies are not moving so much in the earthquake zone. People are sticking with their parties and have different reasons for doing so, including AKP supporters thinking their government benefits are linked to Erdogan staying in the presidency, and CHP supporters sticking with CHP for the reasons that they do. So do you have any insight into how the earthquake might impact voter behavior? And then we can go into logistics, which seem to be absent on voting day.
Absent is certainly the word. In terms of the way the earthquake will impact the people's voting preferences, this is a frustrating black hole. I have to be frank here. I feel like I've said quite a lot of I don't knows in this broadcast so far, but this is perhaps the biggest of the lot, because Turkish polling is so unreliable in so many ways, and because the electorate list isn't as healthy as we would like. We don't know how many people really who were in the 11 provinces affected by the earthquake are still living in those places. It's not clear yet. We're not able to build a picture of which way their votes will go, and we won't know until they actually vote and we see the outcomes that come out of the individual ballot boxes. I would have expected that there is a swing against the government in a lot of those provinces. Hatay is and Diego, you've been there, you've seen it. I actually haven't seen it since the earthquake. The scale of the devastation is horrendous. And before the election, Hatay was a competitive province. It was one of those places where the major parties, all four as it was then, five as it is now, were competitive. And so, I mean, if you had asked me before the election, which way will Hatay vote, I would have said that the opposition are likelier to produce more MPs, simply because they've got an opposition mayor, and they are so that there's a level of hostility building up against the government anyway. Given how inept the government response was to the earthquake, and the sheer numbers of people who didn't get the help they need from the government when they needed it in those crucial hours and days after the earthquake, it's just a question of where that anger will be delivered. And I cannot say for sure that anger will be directed towards the government, because we cannot say for sure how many people are there to be angry, if you see what I mean. But you got the sense of the ground, Diego, I think better than I did in Hatay. There are other provinces in the earthquake zone where we're less likely, I think, to see an anti-government swing. Şanlıurfa counts among them, but Şanlıurfa is quite strong with the AK Party. Diyarbakır is counted because one of its districts was part of it, and that's kind of very likely to be taken by Yeşil Sol, the party that's running on behalf of the HDP this time, and the opposition alliance putting great stock by Adıyaman, which looks like it's become a competitive seat, but again, I can't say for sure.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of speculation here with my peers, colleagues, about what it means not to have buses shuttling people back to ballot boxes, because if most of those provinces are heavy AKP provinces, does it change anything? Maybe there'll be a seat here or there taken from the parliament, depending on how people vote. But Hatay seems to be the real one that could swing in either direction based on how many votes get cast there, right? Would you support that? I know it's speculative.
Absolutely. No, Hatay is, I mean, I've got a list of 3 or 4 provinces that I'll be watching, not counting Istanbul on election night, and Hatay is on that list, simply because it would have been on that list before the election, but all the things that we've talked about makes me want to follow Hatay even closer than before.
What are the other provinces we have to ask?
Well, so I'll be looking, I always follow Mersin for the similar reasons to Hatay, because Mersin is competitive with more of a nationalist tinge, I'd say, but all 5 parties have got a stake in for Mersin, and the way that the vote is distributed, I've just lost my numbers in front, which I did have in front of me, so I could actually tell you exactly how many MPs there were in Mersin. Oh, here we go. It's coming up right now. So in the last election, the AK Party took 4, CHP took 2, HDP, MHP, and İYİ Party all took 2 each. And that's out of 13 possible seats. It seems the AK Party and the MHP will lose a seat each, but if they lose more, that will be a sign that this election is swinging much more towards the opposition than we expected, particularly in the parliamentary election. I also follow Erzincan because it's a small seat. It reports fairly quickly, but it's Anatolian, very strong with nationalists, but the opposition was in with a bid always for that seat. But they're now standing Mustafa Sarıgül, who is from Erzincan, even though he associates himself normally with Istanbul. So there's a strong opposition candidate there. So I'll be looking at Erzincan as well. And also I follow Mardin to get a bellwether of the Kurdish vote, because Diyarbakır is not a competitive seat, not a competitive district, but Mardin tends to be in the battle between the votes for conservative and left-wing Kurds.
Yeah, and I think Erdogan's speaking in Mardin right now as we talk. So
well, there you are. I didn't actually know that, but I'm glad that he's confirmed my view.
Yeah, he's had a busy schedule. I follow him closely. A bit shocked at how little the message is changing between his speeches. It seems to be some mix of linking the opposition with terrorists of different kinds that are terrorist groups that don't even work together, and then calling them LGBT supporters, which, that's the strategy, and he's repeating it. I don't know how that compares. A personal question from me to you: is this how it normally is in Turkish elections, or do we have varied messages on the campaign trail? Because it seems like Erdogan's repeating himself in the last week or two.
Repeating themselves is not necessarily a bad thing in any election, because consistency of message is the kind of thing that drills through to voters. What I find fascinating about this election is that the man and the party that normally sets the narrative, sets the tone for any Turkish election that's been held this century so far, is failing. Up until now, it's been Recep Tayyip Erdogan, it's been the AK Party that have basically decided all the campaign messages, all the tone, the rhetoric, the controversies. They were all set by the AK Party, and they ran a very efficient machine. And it was the opposition that was scrambling to answer everything that the AK Party brought onto the table. And they were so good at it that up until 2 elections ago, I think, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, in the week before voting day, would say, I declare to all other party leaders, if my party isn't first in this election, I will resign. Can you say the same? And no opposition leader could answer them, simply because he was confident. He knew he would be the first, the top party. This election has been the opposite. It's flipped. The consistency of messages coming from the opposition, from the main opposition alliance, and not from Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And it's Erdogan who seems to be scrambling, trying to get answers across. And seeing as we're talking about campaign messaging, there's one more point that I'd like to make about the conduct of the campaign so far. A lot of opposition-minded Turkish friends of mine, some of whom may be watching this actually at the moment, will disagree with me on this, but AK Party messaging up until the middle of the last decade has been largely positive in elections, talking about hope, about possibility, about increased prosperity. The only negative sides of their campaigning, generally speaking, was about how bad things used to be before the AK Party came to power. The AK Party in this election is monumentally negative and bringing out all the aspects that you spoke about. There's hatred really towards not just LGBT people. That's a significant part of the campaign, and they're playing on the conservative attitudes of many of their voters, the religious attitudes of many of their voters, but hatred also towards women and towards a lot of the fabric that Turkey has been cut from over the last 100 years. And against that hatred, you have an opposition that is talking about hope and the possibility of prosperity and the elimination of corruption. I would never have predicted at the start of this year that the campaign could have flipped quite so starkly as it has in the last 4 or 5 months.
Yeah, likewise. I think when Kılıçdaroğlu announced his candidacy, there were low expectations, but he has filled the role fairly well, more beyond expectations, I would say. And he's taken control of the narrative, like you said, which is interesting because I haven't lived in a Turkey that wasn't guided by Erdogan completely. The narrative, at least the news cycle, was guided by Erdogan, and all of a sudden it's not, through these Twitter speeches that Kılıçdaroğlu is publishing consistently. So back to the earthquake zone.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, logistics, what's going on? Is there just no resources? I mean, why is it not organized, the voting down there? Any ideas? I know this is speculative.
Well, it's what we expected would happen, isn't it? Really, when you have a catastrophic a catastrophic earthquake on the scale that we had, in a way, it's almost what we predicted would happen when it struck at the beginning of February. You can't hold such a monumental democratic exercise after such a calamity has happened. My fear is that the stories of shall we say, electoral mischief, of votes going missing, of dead people voting, of fraud on perhaps an even larger scale than that. The dead people voting part will be very difficult to replicate en masse, for reasons we can get into if you like. But I fear that it will feed the feelings of uncertainty about the election results, which is why, if it's a close call, particularly in the presidential election, there's a fear that that this result will be contested, and not just in the courts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll have to see. It'll be a lot of private vehicles apparently to get people to voting booths if they go. I mean, many people are just trying to, get water, food, and still at this point.
Well,
so,
and the parties did pledge that they would, opposition parties in particular, did pledge they would organise those. So, and I don't know what the latest is in terms of buses, but there was a huge amount of confidence that that would happen. And as I have to admit ignorance of this, I don't know the latest, but I would be surprised, given the quality of the opposition's messaging and given how effective they've been in so many ways organising themselves so far, that they wouldn't, if they hadn't organised buses in the way that they said they would, I would be rather surprised.
Yeah. Is there just wondering, is there a bus company owner that supports the opposition? I know Metrobus is AKP supporting, right? Is there like a big businessman that can just donate buses? I'm just wondering.
It feels like it would be locally arranged. It may well be that opposition-run councils, municipalities will send buses because they're the ones who will have a stock. So I'm thinking Adana here, Ankara, Istanbul. There may be something along those lines. But again, these are buses that are needed in their cities as well. So and that would also feed into the kind of cronyism that the opposition has spent so long criticising. What is a bus from Istanbul doing in driving all the way down to Hatay? So I'm not aware of any bus company that's explicitly owned by the opposition. But then again, most business owners in Turkey, as I'm sure you know, don't tend to openly say, I support the opposition and I'm against the government, because it doesn't make good business sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just had to ask. These are things I've talked about in private, so good to have other people hear them and hear the responses. Moving on, we have some technical questions on the elections.
Yeah.
If there is a second round in the presidential election, any ideas who will have the advantage? And I guess it depends on who wins the parliamentary majority, right?
Well, there's quite a lot of questions in that one question, actually. But let's just focusing just on the mechanics of the second round first. Turkey is very politically inexperienced when it comes to second rounds of presidential elections, because they've held 2 elections so far, and both of those, the winning candidates got more than 50% of the votes in the first round. And crucially, the opposition have accepted that result. They weren't happy about it, but they didn't dispute it. There are national elections or national votes in Turkey that the opposition have never accepted, in particular the 2017 referendum. But in terms of presidential elections, it has never been in doubt that the top candidate in the last 2 elections won in the first round. They've never done a second round before, and so it will feel very strange. And I don't just mean that in terms of people going to vote 2 weeks after the last time they voted. That will be fairly ordinary, I'm sure. Though the disruption and the difficulties around that, people will grumble about. It's more about that 2-week period between election 1 and election 2, which will be odd, because I can't predict how politicians will behave. I can't predict what the authorities will be doing, how much jostling will be going on to try and ensure that one candidate or the other gets the votes that, or rather the support of influential people that they expect. It could be gloriously chaotic. It could be horrendously chaotic. I know people who are doomsaying, who say, I'm not going back to Turkey, or I'm going to leave Turkey if it goes to a second round, because I worry about incidents of violence. I worry about my personal safety. I feel those are perhaps overstated, but it's a very awkward time from that point of view. The substance of your question, though, was who is likely to be more advantageous when it comes to a presidential election, especially if it goes to a second round. All I can really go is on two things: the polling, which I've already said is unreliable at best, and the mood of the election. And on both those counts, it's very clear to me that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is leading this election. I have only seen one or two polls where President Erdogan is ahead, and this is in a first round poll rather. And in those, his lead has been extremely narrow enough to be between any margin of error. This is a election that the opposition candidate is leading. So it follows that if it goes to a second round, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu would be in the most advantageous position to win the second time around as well. But it's the bigger question to ask is who he would be looking to convince to draw to his side. And there's been talk of Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu getting perhaps 60% of the vote in a second round outcome. That feels far-fetched to me, simply because both of the two big candidates have a very large core vote. And transfers between one side and the other feel very unlikely to me. There will be some, of course. There'll be some who voted Erdogan in the first round and who would vote Kılıçdaroğlu in the second, or who voted Kılıçdaroğlu the first time around and went Erdogan the next time around. But those are going to be very small. It's going to be a competition for the other two candidates' votes. And the share of the vote that those two candidates are predicted to get is so small that the difference between Kılıçdaroğlu and Erdogan isn't likely to be more than, I'd say, 10% at best. But if I had to put my money down somewhere, I would say this is going to be an election won by Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. Do I think it's going to end in the first or the second round? Again, if I have to give an answer, I'd say probably the first round. But that's all subject to all the provisos that I've put out before. This is a very, very difficult election to read.
So we have a prediction. You're thinking Kılıçdaroğlu.
I think Kılıçdaroğlu will win. It feels that's my call. Go on, I've said it.
Yeah, it feels wrong, right? We shouldn't do this as journalists, but it's a main question we've been getting asked for about a year, right? So Kılıçdaroğlu is your gut. Let's see what happens. I mean,
I absolutely could be wrong, but there is to substantiate that answer a little bit more, just based on fact. There is very little to show that Recep Tayyip Erdogan has the support to win this election, because he won the first round of the last two elections with more than 50% of the vote, but narrowly. The most he's ever got was just shy of 53%, and that was at the height of his popularity. He needs to at least retain that level of support in this upcoming election in order to win in the first round. And we know for a fact that the Turkish president is less popular than he was 5 years ago and less popular than he was 9 years ago. And we haven't in this elections campaign seen the Turkish president reaching out to wavering voters, people who used to support him and have gone away. There hasn't been an effort to draw them back. What we have seen the Turkish president do is to lock down the core vote. It's the core vote strategy that he seems to be going along. And it seems to me that his strategy is to try and push this to a second round so that he can squeak a win with 2 extra weeks of campaigning. That's why I say that this is likelier to be a Kılıçdaroğlu victory.
Yeah, I definitely see the lockdown on the core vote that you're describing. I went to rallies. It looks like he's really just focusing on his, supporters that will always be there, and the ones that have left. He's calling half the country terrorist or linked to terrorist at this point. which isn't exactly, appealing if you're trying to reach across.
It's not appealing, you're right. And it was also, we should say, it was the strategy in the local elections in 2019 to attack the other side, to say that they are fundamentally trying to destroy the Turkey that we know. And that strategy didn't work. It narrowly didn't work in the first cancelled election in Istanbul, where Ekrem İmamoğlu won by only about 13,000 votes. But it didn't work. So they're gambling on it working this time around. I can't see the signs of it working in this case either, particularly as there is so much discomfort within the government side. So sorry, Diego, I'm going on, but let me just say this one thing. You went to a rally, a pro-government rally in, was it in Istanbul that you went to?
In Rize.
We went to Rize. Well, so it was even more vociferous, I'm sure, over there. But so there's a lot of crowd pleasing going on, and there are people who are happy with the government and are happy to support them. But there's also a lot of issues that are not cutting through. There is the fact that the president has decided to ally himself with a fairly extremist right-wing Kurdish group, the Hüdapar, and include candidates among them, doesn't tally well with the fact that he's also trying to seek the Turkish nationalist vote, and Turkish nationalists are uncomfortable about that. We know this for a fact. There are also other concerns about the way in which women are being treated, and this was a party that advocated women's rights. There are lots of fissures going on, and there aren't enough efforts at unity. So it's the tea leaves don't look good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's so much I want to ask, but we have a lot of other questions. One of them involves the cabinet officials running as ministers and then having the electoral council, the YSK, basically allow this, making amendments to the electoral law to allow cabinet members to keep their positions and be candidates at the same time. Would you say this is a sign of this desperation, trying to win aspect from the AKP?
It's some might call it a sensible precaution, because the being elected to parliament in Turkey, unlike lots of other countries, Turkish parliamentarians get full immunity from any kind of prosecution, irrespective of if the charge relates to things that they have done while they were MPs or things that they have done in parliament, or whether or not it relates to things that they did before they became MPs. So if I was running for parliament and I shot you dead and I was elected an MP, I wouldn't be prosecuted for your murder until after my term as an MP ends. That's just how the law works in Turkey. I'm not saying that anyone along the ranks of the AK Party have been suspected of any kind of heinous crime on that level, but it makes sense that for them to offer themselves that level of protection. It's also a move by President Erdogan to ensure that he can have as wide a choice as he likes for his future cabinet if he wins the election, because he's given all his dual henchmen a nice role in parliament. They will all take salaries. There's a generous pension involved, so that he can't say that he's done them badly. But at the same time, he doesn't have to reappoint them as ministers come the election. One interesting point, which is a calculation I'm sure they've taken into account, is that if he does want to reappoint any of the ministers, so if President Erdogan wins the election, and if he wants to reappoint, let's say, Süleyman Soylu as the interior minister, Süleyman Soylu will need to resign as an MP. And that means one fewer seat for the AK Party in a chamber that is likely to be in the balance in terms of control as it is. There is no real system in Turkey for by-elections and for refilling seats that are vacant. So that seat will stay vacant. It's certainly what happened last time around when the foreign minister, Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, ran for parliament and promptly resigned when he was appointed foreign minister again. There are a few others that don't occur to me right now. I can't remember, if I'm honest with you, if Süleyman Soylu ran for parliament in the last election, or whether he just stayed on in his role. But the principle is there, and it's an interesting factor, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, on Soylu, he requested to monitor ballot box data, and the YSK said no. So the question is this a sign that fair elections are possible, or do you think that this means Soylu will try to intervene in the results in his own way?
Um, Fair elections are not possible. I've been saying this for years about Turkey. Turkey's elections are not free and fair; they're free and unfair, because the advantage is heavily weighted towards the governing side, simply in terms of the ability to reach the airwaves, in terms of the kind of access to propaganda and travel and all sorts of materials that they have. It's unrivaled when it comes to the opposition. But you were asking specifically in terms of election interference, I think. The YSK decision about the ballot boxes is a very interesting one. There wasn't a basis in law for the Interior Ministry to monitor ballot box results. It's just not there. And there are other countries where it happens. I know for a fact that in Israel, for example, the Ministry for the Interior does actually oversee the counting of the ballot boxes. But this is talking about creating a different mechanism to monitor the actual votes and to bring in police and the gendarme to try and ensure the security of the votes, which hasn't been done before. My reading of that decision, of the rejection of that decision, is similar to my reading of some recent decisions that have come from the Constitutional Court in Turkey, which again haven't been necessarily favourable to the government. It may well be that there are some independent-minded judges and officials who are beginning to think that there could be an end in sight and are beginning to show their weight a little bit more, because it was the right decision. It was the decision that they should take. Perhaps we've become too accustomed to every decision going in favor of the government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we have a lot of questions about fraud. Every time that these are asked, a lot of Turkish commentators note that democracy is important here. People don't take election interference lightly. Turkish citizens will protect the ballot box, and there are many observers on the site that are dedicated to doing their job. So it's not, easy, let's say, or a passive stance on fraud in Turkey. So with that said, do you expect big problems and irregularities? And would you agree with the fact that there would need to be a significant difference in the vote to avoid such problems? Basically, the margin needs to be wide. If we're in a tight race, there could be one of these power outages or result reporting outages that we've seen in past elections, or a rerun like in the Istanbul election. What do you make of all that?
So a number of points that I'm just making a note here so I don't forget a point that I'm going to make later on. I think that in terms of fraud, it's very elections aren't easy to steal. It's your point about the margin is an important one. If it turns out that there's blue sky between one party and another, it's very difficult for the losing side to credibly claim that there has been fraud at the ballot box. Simply because it's just the wealth of data and the wealth of evidence that shows it's difficult to steal that election. You're right that when the margin is narrow, that is when it becomes more possible for this kind of thing to happen. Turkey is lucky in the sense that it doesn't have, for instance, an American style electoral college system. So you don't have people voting for specific provinces, and then those provinces send a certain number of points or an electoral college. They don't have that. It is pure votes here. The candidate that gets the most votes in the presidential election will win. It's as simple as that. And so if we're talking about a margin of in the millions between one candidate and another, it feels very difficult for those allegations of fraud to be made. So we'd have to watch very, very carefully to see how they articulate those claims. What happened in 2019 in Istanbul was fascinating because of how brazen the way the election was cancelled was. If you're not a Turkish citizen, and I know you're not, so you wouldn't have, well, you haven't voted yet. Nobody has voted apart from the overseas people. I voted, so I can tell you that I was given 2 ballot papers. One was about, I'd say, the size of that, and one was probably that on a massive length. It's very difficult to show you lengths here, but one was very long and one was very short, and they were the same size. I had to stamp my preference on both of those, and then I folded it up and put it into an envelope, which was actually a rather difficult fit. 2 ballot papers going into one envelope, and I pop that into the ballot box, and that's my vote done. In the mayoral election in 2019, there were 3 different votes, unless I'm mistaken. I think it was 3 different votes, one for the mayor of Istanbul, one for the mayor of the district, and one for the assembly of the district in Istanbul. So 3 ballot papers in the same envelope. The opposition's argument was that how is it possible that there was ballot fraud for one of those ballot papers in the same envelope, whereas the other 2 were considered to be valid? The answer was that the opposition candidates won the mayoral election, whereas government-friendly candidates, generally speaking, took the votes in the other 2. It would be to repeat that level of a claim of electoral fraud on a national scale, to say that the 2 votes that I put into those envelopes, one of them was valid and the other one was not, would be an astonishing move. And I don't see it happening. It doesn't feel like it's going to happen to me.
Yeah. And we have questions about whether people would protest such a move. I would imagine yes.
Absolutely, imagine they would.
So we could see some visible protests if there is. We could see some backlash. On the same line, we have a question, a serious one, about the Turkish military. Are they somehow involved in the election? Is campaigning allowed in military barracks? And
soldiers can't vote.
Okay.
So no is the answer to that one. Prisoners can vote, soldiers can't. Retired soldiers certainly can, but if you are actively in uniform, you are not allowed to vote, and that's been the case for decades.
Yeah, Defense Minister Akar, he's been fairly neutral, it seems, up to this point in the election campaign. We have a question about his power to influence the military to act in regards to elections.
Yes. Yes, there's been a lot of chatter about Hulusi Akar and his potential role in the upcoming election. I'm trying to pick my words carefully, but I'm not entirely sure why. Hulusi,
touchy subject.
It is a very touchy subject. And the reason why it is a touchy subject, there will be some viewers who will be watching this saying, well, yes, I know exactly what he's thinking about. And there'll be some who will have absolutely no idea what I'm thinking about. So let me be perfectly clear. Hulusi Akar, the defense minister, who was appointed defense minister after the coup attempt, used to be the head of the army. On the night of the 2016 coup, in Turkey on the 15th of July 2016, there were a series of events that happened in Ankara about which we still do not know the precise chain of events. We know that the man who is now the defense minister was taken hostage by groups that were carrying out the coup, the groups that are loyal to, that the government says are loyal to Fethullah Gulen. And the narrative that we've been told since then is that he refused to acquiesce. The reason I'm bringing up something that is so unclear is because there seems to be some similar mutterings again about a potential role that he would have after this election. I don't see. Well, firstly, I do not see any a prospect of a military intervention based on the outcome of this election. That isn't something that the military has done before. They've certainly pushed Turkish voters in a certain direction and say, you mustn't vote for this person, you must vote for that person. And they have been disappointed in the past. I don't see that happening. But I do envisage a scenario where if the Turkish president loses, if President Erdogan loses this election and he loses narrowly, and he doesn't get an endorsement from his defense minister, that could be a key moment in this election being called for Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. So does that make sense? I feel like I've waffled a bit in trying to get that message across.
I was reading, but I think you did a good job. We're going to leave it there. People can ask follow-up questions if they have them. There's a question about Syrians and their role in the elections. There's about 200,000 Syrians who got Turkish citizenship and can vote. Reports indicate they're pro-Erdogan, but there's 4 million Syrians, so it's a really small portion, and this small group of Syrians that can vote shouldn't have a huge impact on the votes. The person is asking how xenophobia and anti-refugee sentiments are factoring into campaigns. Just to briefly outline, both candidates are more or less promising to send them back in 2 years. And I see this repeated by some of the smaller parties as well. But realistically, Assad is in control. Where would they go, and are they safe? There's just logistic problems, but the promises are still there. So what can you say about Syrians' role in the elections?
I don't see much evidence really that the Syrian refugees who have since become Turkish citizens will materially affect the outcome of this election one way or the other. The numbers don't seem large enough. It might be possible to build a case that certain MPs have been elected in one side rather than another, but Turkish elections do not have profiling. There is, for instance, no exit poll. They don't take a random sample of voters coming out of a ballot station like they do in many Western countries and ask them questions not just about who they voted for, but what kind of person they are, so that they can build a generalized picture of who voted in which way or the other. There are studies that will come out, I'm sure, in the days afterwards, but that's based on different interpretations of the data. So that's that from that point of view. In terms of anti-Syrian sentiment, well, you're right, it's much, much stronger, and it pervades across all parties. Simply because there's a sense in Turkey that enough is enough, and it isn't just a anti-Syrian sentiment. It's an anti-Iranian, an anti-Afghan, and to an extent, anti-Iraqi Kurdish sentiment as well. A lot of these people are using Turkey as a stepping stone to get on to Europe and to beyond. But Turkey is in the strange situation of having there are many European countries that have exactly the same attitude. The send them home message is very strong for a certain body of voters.
Yeah. So we're at the 1 hour mark. We can continue for another 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
Well, if there are more questions, I'm happy to go for another 10 minutes.
Okay. We have one from Ingrid, our team member, who is asking about EU parties decline, and just more info on this. What's the reason behind EU parties dip in support, and was Meral Akşener's stunt, I don't know what to call it, over Kılıçdaroğlu's candidacy, did that weaken her as a party leader? What's your view?
The answer to the second question is yes, it absolutely did, and it was a major factor in her return after that chaotic weekend, because it showed a fundamental lack of understanding of her own voter base, that many people were flocking to her simply because they were conservatively minded, so not likely to vote for the CHP, and anti-Erdogan. And for her to break the best chance that the opposition had of unseating Erdogan went down very poorly with her voter base. And to her credit, she recognized that very quickly and came back. But I'm afraid I was talking at the same time as you were reading out the first question, so I didn't hear it.
Just can you tell us a bit more about EU parties' decline that you mentioned in the beginning, and what's the reason?
The EU parties' decline. Oh well, that was that follows through with what I was saying. It's There is a part of it is driven by what happened in March and that extraordinary argument. Part of it is driven by a genuine rise in support for the CHP. There are people who would never have voted CHP before, but have decided that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is, to use the British phrase, a good egg, somebody worth supporting. And that's remarkable, really, because the CHP's campaigning in this election has been very low key. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu has been everywhere, but he doesn't wear on his lapel, he doesn't wear the CHP logo. A lot of the internet spots, the television spots, don't carry the CHP's branding. And yet, despite that, it's looking to get one of the highest results in a general election that it's had in decades, possibly half a century. And a lot of E-Party voters are sort of making a choice that way rather than the other. You'll notice that Miray Akşener hasn't really in recent days been talking about becoming the top party in this election anymore. That doesn't mean that she can't manage it in the future, but she's decided for the next, well, what's left of this week, that putting herself behind Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is the way to go forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also thought her speech at the Maltepe rally in Istanbul this weekend was one of the weaker ones. It just felt like her standing wasn't what it was in the past. Let's see what happens, though. Anything can happen.
She is a very popular politician, and there is her brand of fiery, almost aggressive talk is one that voters like. It's one of the reasons why Erdogan has been so popular in the past. Her campaign, her last parliamentary speech to her parliamentary group, the one where she picked out the bullets from the row in front of her and angrily chucked those on the floor, which was part of an election spot, that was hugely effective, and it worked very well for them. But it's also, we are also in the place with only a few days before the election. People are making their minds up, and it's natural, I think, that the votes are gravitating in the way that they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and talking about making your minds up and these undecided in the middle voters, we have a question about İnce and whether he's running as a candidate out of bitterness. This is the question. For background, İnce and Kılıçdaroğlu have a long history of trying to get CHP leadership. İnce obviously was the candidate for the CHP in the last presidential election. It seems like he's a fighter, and he might not be doing this as a spoiler. He might actually think he should be a presidential candidate. What do you make of it?
I've, as I'm sure you have, met quite a few people who are utterly bewildered by him and the reasons why he's running, given that the chances of him running are of winning are minuscule to none. And because it's Turkey, many people draw the conclusion that there must be some shadowy force behind him. Somebody must be, the phrase dış güç is always thrown about, and perhaps they are behind İnce. It doesn't seem to be that way. I'm instinctively I instinctively oppose conspiracy theories on the basis that they aren't based in fact. İnce is a proud man, and dare I say, not a particularly wise one in this case. It isn't an election that he is likely to make any kind of an impact. But there was an opportunity for him to be a central part of the opposition alliance. A ministerial role for him was not unthinkable. But I think he has got it in his mind that because he was a presidential candidate who stood against President Erdogan, that he needs to be treated with a certain amount of respect. I know quite a few people like Muharrem İnce in Turkey. They're not politicians, but this matter of respecting your elders, respecting what people have done rather than what they're going to do, is weighs very strongly in a lot of Turkish men, and Muharrem İnce is one of them.
Yeah, the expectation of respect. There's a few more questions. Let's try to maybe answer them quickly.
Okay.
Today I had a discussion about TIP, the Workers' Party, and how they might draw some votes from the Yeşil Sol party. because voters that used to want an alternative would vote for HDP, but now that there's TIP and Yeşil Sol, this might splinter that leftist third way vote. Could this result in less seats for these smaller parties that could potentially advantage the AKP, which is the second most popular party in the Southeast after the HDP, Yeşil Sol party?
Broadly, yes. In the Southeast, no. TIP aren't standing any candidates in the Southeast. There's a map which I'll tweet out again at some stage, which shows where you can sort of overlay the candidates of the Yeşil Sol party and the TIP on top of them, and you'll see that TIP are running candidates in the West. So in places like Diyarbakir and Mardin and Van and Hakkari and all the rest of them, there are no TIP candidates. It's YSP, Yeşil Sol all the way. But in places like Istanbul, there is a very real risk that TIP will draw votes away from the YSP, who is also standing candidates, and there's a chance that neither party will benefit from that. But in terms of voter commitment, the loyalty that voters feel towards a party, I would say that TIP is actually drawing more votes from the CHP than it is drawing from Yeşil Sol, simply because that is the kind of mindset. Turkish, left-wing, maybe the CHP isn't left-wing enough. TIP are a very effective opposition party. They punch above their weight. Let's give them their support, is what many voters are thinking.
Mm-hmm. We also have one on foreign election observers, OSCE observers. They do send a delegation, and I don't know how many hundreds of observers to ballot boxes. They go to ballot boxes. So what do you think their role can be? From my experience, the OSCE observers go to very, tame ballot boxes in Ankara. For example, when I lived in Ankara, they were in Çankaya. I don't think there's that much going on in Çankaya, whereas you have gunfights down in Urfa and Kilis, and there's no OSCE observer at those places. What do you think?
Well, it's true. But I think the OSCE do a decent job, though, and I don't think that's their role isn't to spot incidents of violence in a ballot box in a rural part of Turkey. I can't tell you how they spread their observers in previous elections because I haven't checked. The OSCE's role really is to look at the broad scheme of the election, beginning from the moment the campaign began up until the point the results are declared, and documenting whether or not there were any irregularities in that build-up. But the actual ballot box observing falls to all the parties, and the CHP observers are going to be key in that particular respect, because they're the ones who are going to be flagging any irregularities that happen at the ballot box.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I guess one more question. We'll do one more.
Sure.
Russia and states in the Balkans openly endorsed Erdogan since the start of the war in Ukraine. I don't hear any criticism towards the human rights situation in Turkey by the EU.
Mm-hmm.
What's the rest of the question? Is it clipped?
Oh.
There's no rest of the question. Sorry. I thought that was the end. So Russia and other countries seem to be endorsing Erdogan. I don't know. I can't finish it for the person.
Well, what I can say is an interesting observation, I think, on the term dış güçler, these foreign agents that seem to be interfering in the election, if you speak to certain Turks. But the West have been very quiet in the run-up to the Turkish election. There hasn't been any endorsements from the EU or from the UK or from the US or from any other Western country. They're keeping very quiet, and I know for a fact that the Western diplomatic corps are keeping very quiet, but watching very keenly at what's happening. So the only foreign agents that seem to be involved in this election are those who support the government and want the government and President Erdogan to remain in office.
Yeah, for example, like deferred payments on Russian gas and deposits in the central bank by some Gulf nations. But
Alleged openings of nuclear power stations and
nuclear power stations. Just a few things to list, but there is one foreign intervention from the West, which is the Economist magazine, and you have to go to their headquarters and tell them, what they did, and give them a piece of your mind. Can you do that for us?
I will do that. Right. I mean, it's only a 20-minute journey for me to The Economist, so I could do that if you liked. I would be astonished if there isn't an UK party-friendly person in London who hasn't gone and already done that and taken a photograph of themselves doing precisely that. Let me say very, very quickly about The Economist, though, is that they've endorsed a candidate in every single election. And up until 2011, it was Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So the idea that the endorsement is unfavourable now that now that they've changed their mind is curious.
Great, and I got the second part of the question, and you answered it, so we did it correctly. Sorry we couldn't get to the other questions. Thank you for joining us. We don't want to make this too long, and I'm sure that Michael would like to, have some water or a break from speaking, because this answered a lot of questions in deep detail. I really appreciate you doing this, and I really look forward to, your coverage of the elections and just seeing what happens, because we're all spectators in this massive historical event that has, world consequences. So good luck to everybody. Thank you, Michael. And
before you go, I need to ask you, Diego, one question. What are you going to do on election day?
Well, disclosure, my wife is a candidate. She's a candidate with Yeşil Sol party, which means I'm recusing myself from reporting on Kurdish politics because I have an obvious conflict of interest there. So I'll be in Diyarbakir, hopefully watching her win a seat in the parliament.
Well, we'll see what happens, won't we?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah. And updates online on Twitter, and definitely follow jamesinturkey.com. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.